He told her to leave the courtroom, his voice a dismissive crack of the whip, calling her out like she was nobody. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly comprehend, was that she had come to investigate him. Special Inspector Alara Vance, silent and sharp as shattered glass, was the ghost the government sent in when justice itself was on trial. She was there to expose the kind of system that looks the other way when a defendant is black, a kind of justice measured not in evidence but in assumption. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She just listened, her stillness a form of gravity in a room filled with noise. And when the time was right, she stood. But when power is blind and pride runs bone deep, will a system listen to a whisper before it collapses under the weight of its own arrogance? What happens when the woman you humiliate and banish walks back through those same doors, not as a witness, but as the one sent to judge you? If that thought just made your heart beat a little faster, tap the like button and share this story. Now come with us and see what happens when silence walks back into the courtroom. They said the court was open to the public, a foundational promise of American democracy, but somehow that promise felt conditional the moment she stepped inside. It was 9:02 a.m. when she entered courtroom 4A. She didn't rush. She didn't hesitate. She simply walked in with the quiet assurance of someone who had every right to be there, but who also knew that most people in this room would think otherwise. She was dressed to be forgotten. A simple navy blue sweater, dark khaki pants, and soft-soled shoes that barely made a sound on the polished tile. No badge was visible, no briefcase in hand. Her only accessory was a slim black leather-bound notebook held calmly in her hands. She took a seat 3 rows from the back, close enough to see the subtle tick in the judge's jaw, yet far enough to melt into the worn grain of the wooden pews. Her name for today was Anna Davis, a cloak of anonymity, and no one in this room needed to know anything more. The room buzzed with the low-grade anxious energy of a Tuesday morning docket. Lawyers in ill-fitting suits leaned in, whispering last-minute instructions to nervous clients. The low hum of the ancient HVAC system competed with the constant shuffle of case files and the sharp, scratching sound of worn heels against the floor. Then came the voice, deep and commanding, cutting through the noise. All rise. Judge Alistair Finch entered with the slow, deliberate gravity of a man who had ruled this specific courtroom for longer than some of the officers outside had been alive. His robe was crisp, his chin held high, his gaze sharp and sweeping, taking in his domain. He sat. The court settled. The first case was called. A young black man, barely 19, was charged with resisting arrest. His wrists were still raw and red from the tightness of the cuffs. His lawyer, a public defender, who looked no older than 30 and was already radiating exhaustion, stood to make a preliminary argument about the arresting officer's excessive use of force. Judge Finch waved a dismissive hand before the young lawyer could get 10 words out. Let's save the speeches for someone who's buying them, counselor. The facts are clear. He ran. He struggled. The officer did his job. Let's proceed. No one flinched. Not the jury pool, not the bailiff, not the boy's mother, who sat in the front row, clutching a tissue as if it were a lifeline. The system was functioning as designed, except for one person. In the third row, the woman in the navy sweater quietly wrote something down in her notebook. The nib of her pen moved with a calm, steady precision. The judge noticed. It began as a flicker of annoyance in his peripheral vision. a spectator paying too much attention. Then it curdled into irritation. Who was this woman scribbling away like she was grading his performance? He squinted at her, his focus narrowing. "You there?" He called out, his voice sharp. "Yes, you, in the blue sweater." Heads turned. The low hum of the courtroom died instantly. Even the defendant looked up, a flicker of curiosity momentarily overriding his fear. Alara lifted her eyes, her gaze steady, polite, unreadable. "Yes, Your Honor." "Who are you here with, counsel media?" "I'm just observing, sir," she replied. Her voice was calm, low, and clear as glass, but its very lack of deference seemed to only make him bristle more. "Well, this isn't a lecture hall, and I don't need activists in my gallery scribbling notes and staring like this is some kind of protest trial." A few nervous murmurs rippled through the back rows. Finch leaned forward, his voice dripping with condescension. "If you want to play activist, there's a park across the street. This is a court of law." Alara didn't blink. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She simply offered him a quiet, powerful form of compliance that felt more like a judgment than his own. She closed her notebook with a soft, final click, stood without a word, and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "Understood." She turned and walked toward the exit. No hurry, no shame. But every pair of eyes in that room followed her. They watched, not for what she said, but for what she didn't. The silence she left behind spoke with more volume than any outburst ever could. A middle-aged woman, near the back wearing a white floral blouse, shook her head ever so slightly. Her lips pursed in disapproval, not at the woman, but at the judge. The bailiff suddenly found the scuff marks on his shoes intensely interesting. Even the boy on trial watched the door long after it had swung shut, as if something vital, some unspoken possibility of fairness, had just been banished from the room. Judge Finch tapped his gavel, a sharp, impatient sound. "Let's move on." But for the rest of that morning, he kept glancing at the third row, at the empty space where she had been. And for a man so accustomed to absolute control, it was the first time in years that something felt profoundly, inexplicably off. It wasn't the first time someone had told her to leave a room she had every right to be in. But this time, she let them. Because this time, getting kicked out of the room wasn't the failure. It was the first data point. The room was never the goal. The system was. 2 blocks away from the courthouse, in a small second-floor office that smelled faintly of old paper and lemon cleaner, Alara Vance sat behind a dusty wooden desk with no nameplate. The window blinds were cracked, casting striped shadows across the floor. She preferred it this way. Plain, quiet, utterly forgettable. Tucked away in a file cabinet behind her was a metal badge that few people ever saw. It bore a federal seal and the words, "Special Inspector Office of the Inspector General, United States Department of Justice." Alara Vance wasn't here for titles. She was here to watch. And what she had seen that morning confirmed her deepest suspicions. She sat perfectly still, replaying the moment in her mind, Finch's tone, his automatic assumption that a black woman paying close attention must be an activist, his casual dismissal. She didn't feel rage. That emotion had burned out of her years ago, leaving behind something colder, harder, and far more useful purpose. Cold, precise, and absolutely unshakable. She opened a drawer and pulled out a thin manila folder. On the tab, written in black marker, were the words Leo Carter, 14, deceased. His school photo was clipped to the front page. He had big, curious eyes and a soft, undefined jawline. He was just a kid. He'd been gunned down during a police chase after being accused of stealing a sandwich and a bottle of juice from a corner store. Witnesses said he was unarmed, that he had his hands up. The arresting officer's body cam had mysteriously malfunctioned at the critical moment. The prosecutor never filed charges against the officer, and the judge who dismissed the Carter family's wrongful death motion, citing lacking sufficient grounds for a civil suit, was Alistair Finch. Elara didn't know Leo Carter personally, but she had met his ghost 100 times over in case files from a dozen different cities, boys whose names lived longer on hashtags than they did in real life. This case was the reason she had said yes when the Attorney General called her. That, and what had happened the last time she'd said no to a dangerous assignment. 3 years ago, her investigation had uncovered a ring of falsified evidence in a Midwest District Attorney's office. 4 wrongful convictions were overturned, and 3 officers were indicted. The victory made national headlines. So did the death threats that followed. They found her car's tires slashed in her own driveway. A red X was spray-painted on her apartment door. They never caught who did it, but the message was clear. After that, Elara stopped showing up to courtrooms in power suits and high heels. She stopped announcing who she was. She learned that power wasn't in speaking louder. It was in being the last one, standing after everyone else assumed you were long gone. That was why she had walked out of courtroom 4A with her head held high. That was why she let the judge call her an activist. And that was why she was here now in this forgotten office, methodically reviewing every ruling Finch had made in the last 7 years. She had already flagged 12 cases where black defendants received maximum sentences despite clear mitigating circumstances. 9 cases where key evidence that could have exonerated a defendant was dismissed without a hearing. 5 cases where police officers accused of excessive force were cleared in under 2 hours. It wasn't just a series of unfortunate events, it was a pattern. And for Elara, it was personal. Her eyes drifted to the window, to the crooked lines of sunlight on the floor. She could still hear the courtroom door closing behind her, not as the sound of failure, but as the sound of a starting gun. The real work had just begun. The hardest part wasn't finding the corruption, a rot that deep always leaves a stench. The hardest part was finding someone on the inside who was willing to admit they could smell it too. The message came through a secure messaging app on a Wednesday afternoon. 1 sentence, no name. Meet me behind the records room. After hours, I'll leave the door ajar. It was the digital equivalent of a whisper, the kind that only comes from someone who's already looked over their shoulder twice today. Elara waited until 7:15 p.m. The courthouse was a hollow shell of its daytime self, the echo of her soft-soled shoes swallowed by the high ceilings. She slipped down a back hallway, past portraits of stern-faced retired judges whose eyes seemed to follow her. The records room was dark, but a door on the far side was open just an inch, spilling a sliver of light onto the dusty floor. Inside stood a woman in a faded grey cardigan, her hair pulled back in a tight, severe bun. Her eyes darted around the room like a sparrow trapped in a shoebox. This was Mrs. Gable, a court clerk, with 17 years of service and a memory like a steel trap. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I don't know who you really are," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly, "but I saw you. Watching. I think I know why you're here." Elara remained silent, letting the woman's courage find its own footing. "Finch. He doesn't have to tell people what to write. He just does things He'll roll his eyes when a black attorney starts to speak. He mumbles things under his breath. I heard him call a defendant's testimony street logic before throwing the motion out. Mrs. Gable swallowed hard, her Adam's apple bobbing. I typed that order. I didn't say anything. I need this job. My husband, he's sick. The insurance. She trailed off, then wordlessly handed Alara a small USB stick. It was a quiet offering, a desperate prayer passed from one hand to another when speaking aloud feels too dangerous. Alara took it, her fingers brushing against Mrs. Gable's. She gave a single, gentle nod. No judgment, no promises, only respect for the bravery it took to make this small, treasonous act. The next day, Alara reached out to a name buried deep in her contact list, David Chen, a former prosecutor from her class at law school. They'd started with the same fire, the same ideals. But while she went into the difficult, thankless work of government oversight, he had gone into the comfortable, lucrative world of private defense. He picked up on the second ring. Ellara, he said, his voice a mix of surprise and caution. Been a long time. I need someone to go on the record, David. She said, dispensing with small talk. There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line. You want me to talk about Finch? He finally asked, his voice dropping. I want you to tell the truth. The truth costs Alara, he said softly, and she could hear the resignation in his voice. More than I'm willing to pay. You think I don't see it? I've seen him throw away young men like they're broken pencils. But I have twins in private school, a mortgage. I have clients who don't want their lawyer making headlines by taking on a sitting judge. You want justice, and I admire that. I always have. But don't ask me to burn down everything I've built just to prove a point. The call ended. Alara sat in the quiet of her plain office, listening to the hum of traffic outside, the sound of a world that just kept moving, no matter what was breaking inside of it. She turned the USB drive over in her fingers. I didn't say anything. Mrs. Gable's voice echoed in her mind. I need the job. That was the true genius of the system Finch had built. It wasn't maintained by brute force, but by quiet, pervasive fear. The fear of losing your job, your reputation, your ability to provide for your family. It was a fear that spread slow and invisible like a crack forming under thick glass. But that was also its vulnerability. It relied on everyone believing they were alone. Alara didn't come here to put one man on trial. She came to show people that the rot wasn't invincible. That silence wasn't the only way to survive. She came to prove that a single voice, once it dared to speak, could give courage to others. She opened her laptop, inserted the drive, and began to read. She didn't sneak in this time. There was no blue sweater, no attempt to hide. On the morning she returned to Courtroom 4A, Special Inspector Alara Vance walked through the front doors, wearing a charcoal grey suit, tailored and sharp as a razor's edge. Her hair was tied back, and her heels clicked on the marble floor with a calm, even rhythm that announced her arrival long before she was seen. A soft gold badge hanging from a chain around her neck lay against her silk blouse. The name on it was clear and unmistakable: Alara Vance, Office of the Inspector General. The bailiff, the same one who had called her uniform a costume in a different story for a different man, straightened his spine as she passed. A young clerk fumbled with a stack of papers. One of the security guards whispered to another, "That's her, isn't it? The one from DC?" By the time Alara took her seat, the same row, the same spot as before, the energy in the room had fundamentally shifted. Judge Finch hadn't entered yet, but the silence was heavier, charged with anticipation. 2 seats behind her, a junior clerk named Devon held his phone below the bench and texted furiously. "She's back, in a suit. Badge says Alara Vance, OIG. He didn't send it to a friend. He sent it to the court administrator. 30 seconds later, a phone buzzed inside the judge's chambers. When Finch stepped into the courtroom, his eyes performed their usual sweep, then stopped cold. There she was, back again. He blinked, once a tiny, almost imperceptible falter, then continued his procession to the bench, his robe flowing behind him as if nothing had changed. But everything had. "Let's proceed," he said, his voice a fraction too loud. "We're already running behind." But there was a tremor in it, now a hairline crack in the marble facade. Alara heard it. During a pause in the proceedings, Finch addressed her without looking at her directly. "Miss Vance," he said, testing the name. "If you are here in an official capacity, I trust you have coordinated with the proper channels." Alara closed her notebook and looked up, her gaze steady and measured. "I'm simply observing your honor. You previously informed me that this courtroom was no place for activists. I assume it still welcomes federal oversight." The room held its breath. A slow, tight smile stretched across Finch's lips. "Of course, we have nothing to hide." But his hand, resting on the edge of the bench, gripped the wood until his knuckles were white. For the rest of the day, he moved through the docket at a frantic pace, cutting off attorneys, dismissing motions with a wave. He was a man trying to outrun his own shadow. By noon, he called for an early recess. He stood too quickly, nearly knocking over his water glass. He caught it, recovered, and walked out, with his chin held high. But his back was rigid, the posture of a man suddenly acutely aware that he was being watched. Alara stayed in her seat for a moment after he left. Then slowly, she stood, adjusted her badge, and walked out, with the same calm, even rhythm. She wasn't chasing him. She was waiting. And he was finally starting to understand that. The summons came without warning. A court officer approached the bench and handed Finch a folded note. He read it, his face paling slightly. "Recess," he announced, his voice strained. He was led down a back corridor to an interior meeting room with no windows. And there she was, already seated at the head of a long, empty table. Her badge lay flat on the polished wood in front of her. "Miss Vance," he began, attempting to seize control. "Special Inspector Vance," she corrected him gently. "Please sit, Judge." He sat. "I wasn't informed of any formal inquiry," he blustered. "That was intentional," she replied. She looked at him, her expression not unkind, but unyielding. "I introduced myself in your courtroom last week. You told me to leave. So now," she slid a thick manila folder across the table, "I am here to review how you've run it." He opened it. Inside were transcripts, flagged rulings, and 3 signed affidavits, one from a former clerk, one from a public defender, and one from a retired prosecutor he had once considered a friend. "You've been building this," he muttered, the color draining from his face. "This," she said quietly, "is accountability." He leaned back, crossing his arms, a last-ditch effort at defiance. "You have no idea the pressure we're under. The backlogs, the media. You sit behind a desk and judge us." "You're right," she said, her voice cutting through his excuses. "I don't know your pressures, but I know this." She turned on a small monitor mounted to the wall. Silent video footage flickered to life, courtroom 4A 2 years prior. A black teenager on trial, nervous and soft-spoken. And Finch, leaning forward, his face contorted in a sneer, his hand slamming down on the bench. "You called him street trash on the record," Elara said, her voice flat. "You destroyed his testimony, not because of the facts, but because of who you assumed he was." She let the silence hang between them, heavy and damning. "We all have biases, Judge. But when you sit on that bench, your biases aren't just thoughts. They are consequences. They are sentences. They are futures ruined." She leaned in, just slightly. "I am not here to humiliate you. I am here because you have forgotten who that bench belongs to. It belongs to the people, all of them." He looked away, his gaze falling on the closed folder. For the first time in 2 decades, Alistair Finch had no ruling to make, no objection, no gavel to bang. There was just the quiet, irrefutable truth, and a woman he had ordered out of his courtroom now sitting across from him, holding his future in her hands. The video of Elara's first quiet exit from the courtroom, filmed by a spectator on a shaky phone, was uploaded to a small local news blog. By the next day, it had been shared over 100,000 times. By nightfall, it was everywhere. People didn't just talk about her, they talked about her stillness, her dignity. Hashtags bloomed, "She's justice," as quiet. She stood. Courtroom fray. Stories poured in. A former foster youth wrote, "I was 11 when a judge laughed at me. Watching her stand made something in me sit taller." A retired nurse posted, "I've been dismissed just for wearing scrubs. She reminded me we don't need volume to be heard." The most liked comment, pinned to the top of a video with millions of views, was from a man who had been exonerated after 12 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit, under a ruling originally handed down by Judge Finch. He wrote, "She didn't shout, she stood, and it was louder than any protest I've ever seen." A one-page notice was posted outside the clerk's office. "Effective immediately, Judge Alistair Finch has chosen to retire from the bench." He disappeared down the sidewalk, a shadow leaving its shape. Upstairs, Elara stood alone in the hallway, looking at the portraits of retired judges. A junior clerk approached her hesitantly. "Special Inspector Vance. It's done." Elara nodded, then looked up at Finch's still-hanging portrait. "Power isn't loud," she said softly, more to herself than to him. "Real power listens." And with that, she turned and walked away, her steps quiet and steady, leaving behind only the weight of something that had finally irrevocably shifted. As she stepped out onto the courthouse steps, she saw them. Not a crowd, just a small gathering of people, and among them, a little girl holding her mother's hand. The girl was staring. Elara met her gaze and offered a small, quiet smile. The little girl leaned into her mother and whispered her voice, carrying on the still air, "Mama, is she the judge now?" Her mother knelt, brushing the hair from her daughter's face. "No, baby," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "She's the one who makes the judges think twice." Elara heard it, and for a moment that felt like a lifetime, she almost stopped walking. She didn't respond. She just kept moving down the steps, past the people, and into the afternoon light. Sometimes, the loudest voice in the room is the one that never has to raise its tone. This story was about quiet strength, about standing firm when the world expects you to sit down. If it moved, you please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who believes in doing what's right, and subscribe for more powerful stories that don't just entertain, but stay with you. Your support is why we keep telling stories that matter. From all of us here Thank you for listening, for believing, and for being part of something bigger. We'll see you in the next story.